he is putting up a giant red flag that Spokane voters would be very, very wise to recognize. This segment is brought to you by Eastside Weight Loss Clinic. I'm down 37 pounds on the program, and I lost most of that in just 2 months. Do what I did and what so many other undivided viewers have done. Schedule your free 15-minute consultation today at eastsideweightlossclinic.com. This has gone beyond, certainly in the last 5 years, like a Seattle issue, where Seattle was sort of the extreme outlier in the state, and they were doing and trying all these crazy things and crazy policies. And, people who are Democrats, but who weren't living in the reality of Seattle were a little disconnected from that, I think. They weren't seeing day to day the homeless crisis, the drug crisis, the crime crisis hadn't really hit them in a meaningful way. It was still relegated to just certain pockets, like in South King County and in downtown Seattle. But what we've seen increasingly so in the last 5 years is these quality of life issues have reached places that never dealt with them before. And in Spokane, one of the things I've expressed concern for on this show is Spokane all of a sudden seems to be eager to try some of the failed policies that got to Seattle to the place that it's in right now. And I don't get that. I don't understand why Seattle couldn't have learned from Portland, couldn't have learned from San Francisco, but it's now Spokane's like, hey, Seattle tried that. Look at Seattle, but let's try it too. Maybe it'll work for us. And now Spokane is starting to see the consequences of that. There is a kind of celebrity chef, I guess I would call him. He's very acclaimed. His name's Chad White. He has a bar and restaurant called Zona Blanca Ceviche Bar. And he announced this week that he's going to be closing it. He said it's a heavy heart, deep reflection. I write this letter to share the difficult decision I have to make about the bar. He posted this on Facebook. He went on to say, he's been very successful, obviously, as far as chefs go. So he says, so why close? The hard truth is that like many businesses in downtown Spokane, we faced a challenging and tough road. The increasing crime, visible drug use, and the damage to public and private property have made it harder and harder to maintain a safe environment for our team and partners who are like family to me and for you, our valued guests. On top of that, despite pouring all my time, energy, and finances into keeping our doors open, I've had to face the reality that I've left very little for my own family in both time and security. So it was a very long kind of open letter to the community on Facebook saying we can't continue to do this anymore. And also for restaurants, in addition to crime and disorder, all of those things lead to less foot traffic, less customers coming in the door, no matter how good of a restaurant you are, increased insurance rates, and as business owners, all of that mounts. And a lot of restaurant owners, even ones like this, they're not making money hand over fist. And so all of those things contribute to an untenable financial situation. He went on to say, to our elected officials, I humbly ask you to recognize the urgency of what's happening in our downtown. If someone like me, who has been fortunate enough to gain national acclaim and enjoy immense support from the community, is struggling this hard to keep my doors open, I can't begin to imagine what it's like for those who don't have the same privileges. The challenges we face are real and growing. And if we don't take immediate action to address the safety and well-being of our downtown, many more businesses, especially the smaller ones, will face even greater struggles in the months ahead. Now is the time for us to come together and protect what makes Spokane. He is putting up a giant red flag that Spokane voters would be very, very wise to recognize. And there were businesses in Seattle over the past 10 years that tried to do the same thing, that tried to say something, and they were, vilified and called NIMBYs, not in my backyard, or, they couldn't, it was like saying something, being a pragmatist and saying, no, we can't have homeless people sleeping in the alcove of our business. It was like, well, you can't say that. You're an extremist, you're right wing, whatever it is. And so businesses that tried to raise a red flag and set off alarm bells over the last 10 years in Seattle, by and large, were just kind of ignored. Spokane has an opportunity not to do the same thing. Specifically Spokane voters, and saying, look, clearly things are getting to a point where if we don't do something now, it's going to spiral out of control. The question is, are elected leaders in Spokane listening? You'll recall that Spokane had a Republican mayor. She lost the last election. Now Lisa Brown is their Democratic mayor. Well, I got to say, I'm not too confident in the leaders of Spokane based on what has happened in the days after Chef Chad White announced that he's closing this restaurant. So he ends up having a press conference. There's a lot of interest, obviously, in this. And community members show up and the media, and they tried to get elected leaders to come. The Center Square reported on it. The headline, Spokane council member apologizes on behalf of city for state of public safety. Great headline, like somebody apologized, that's awesome. But let's dive in a little more. It says council member Jonathan Bingle held a press conference on Monday apologizing on behalf of Spokane following the announcement that Zona Blanca, an upscale restaurant, would close after being broken into 20 times. Following the announcement, the local business community called on their elected officials to host a press conference to apologize. While a few tuned in to an informal email thread to make their voices heard, only Bingle rose and publicly apologized at the event. Sheldon Jackson, chief executive officer of a development company, told the Center Square that he asked the rest of the city council, Mayor Lisa Brown, and police chief Kevin Hall to attend the event 5 or 6 times without any luck. So here you have people reaching out to their elected leaders saying, hey, we're having this press conference on public safety. Will you attend? Asking 5 or 6 times. The mayor, the police chief, no one shows up except this one council member. And I give this council member credit. Don't know anything about him. Don't know anything about his politics. In the context of this, I don't care to know, because it takes a lot to apologize. And I'm starting to realize that from politicians. They just are unwilling to admit fault or to admit mistake. The press conference, well, it wasn't a press conference. The memorial walk that we were at a few days ago for Ruth Dalton in Seattle is a prime example of this. I wasn't going to get into it at the time because it just felt inappropriate. But now that a few days have passed, you have Ruth Dalton, elderly dog walker, murdered in broad daylight in an attempted carjacking by an 8-time felon who was living in some housing that's funded with taxpayer money. And so, days go by, I think it was 2 weeks that had gone by since, was it 2 weeks? Yeah, since Ruth Dalton was killed. And her granddaughter told me on this show, no one in the city's reached out to me. We haven't heard from the mayor. We haven't heard from the police chief. She hadn't heard up to that point from any of the city council members, although after that she did hear from one. So anyway, they put on this memorial walk for Ruth Dalton. And Nicole and I went, my husband went, community members went, and city leaders who had said very little about it showed up. And it's like, okay, that's fine. I'm glad you're there. And we were kind of sitting there, and Nicole and I were on the peripheral. And, Mayor Bruce Harrell gets up. I don't know how many times I rolled my eyes during that man's remarks. I was just blown away. I mean, nothing of substance, nothing to speak to the pain and anger and concern and fear of the people standing in front of him from that community. It was just so vapid and so meaningless, and no apology. As the mayor... And I remember interviewing Bruce Harrell when he ran for mayor when I was in mainstream news, the buck stops with me. As I'm the mayor, I take responsibility. Then get up there, and even if you don't freaking mean it, say, hey, the crime crisis is out of control. I take responsibility. I apologize. We're going to fix this. None of that. None of that.
He actually said leaders need to do more, but didn't say himself.
No, it's that starts with me, right? Yeah. That starts with me. And so there's this inability to recognize, someone has to take, it starts with someone taking responsibility. And is it all to blame? Is Mayor Bruce Harrell, for instance, to blame for everything? No. Is Lisa Brown in Spokane to blame for everything? No. Right before her, Nadine Woodward, who is the Republican mayor, it's not as if there was no crime when she was the mayor. It's not as if Lisa Brown's elected immediately overnight, all of a sudden there's crime, homelessness, and drug abuse. So no, but it starts with someone being willing to take responsibility and then to do what needs to be done, to say no to soft on crime policies, to say no to people who are using drugs out in the open, to say, no, you can't camp in alcoves. No, we're not going to allow that. We've got shelter for you. If you won't take it, get the hell out of here. But that's the thing, is they won't allow themselves an ounce of humility, an ounce of self-reflection, and to say, look, I asked for this job. You can blame me for everything. I take blame me. And we're going to move forward from here. And so, yeah, the fact one council member shows up, mayor doesn't show up, police chief doesn't show up, none of the other council members show up, although they said stuff on a private email chain like, oh, yeah. It's like, okay, you need to tell your community that you're going to do something about it and take responsibility so they can then hold you accountable to whatever promises that you might make for them. But Spokane is rapidly going down the same path as Seattle. Rapidly. And if Spokane voters don't stand up and put an end to it right now, you are going to be in the same position as Seattle. And let me tell you from experience, that takes a long time to dig yourself out of. I don't know how long it'll take Seattle to dig itself out of this situation, if it ever has the political will to do it. Look at Portland. I mean, in Oregon, they decriminalized drugs. 2 years later, they're like, oops, we shouldn't have done that. And now they're trying to dig themselves out of that mess. Look at San Francisco, shell of its former self. You really don't have enough examples of what extreme progressivism and socialist policies do to once beautiful, thriving cities? Come on, Spokane.